Hey everyone, Keto Comic, back with part two of Jeffrey MacDonald. Let's recap our first part. We ended on me going over the blood evidence in which the military investigators were able to put together the order in which they thought the murders happened based on the fact that all four members of the MacDonald family had different blood types, which is very unusual. And based on the patterns of blood and the locations of the blood throughout the house, they were able to determine within maybe a 10% error rate of how the murders played out. So basically, the military were not buying Jeffrey's explanation of four hippies breaking into the house and causing the murder. But the blood evidence was not the only evidence that led military investigators to not buy his story. It was the major part, but it wasn't all of it. The other pieces of kind of conflicting evidence were as follows. Basically, the first was that they found an Esquire magazine in the middle of the living room. And remember, in the living room itself did not look like a fight had ever taken place. There was very little blood in the living room, very little upheaval, only a coffee table that had been turned upside down, which could easily be done by just simply lifting it and turning it. It wasn't consistent with a fight in which it could have been flipped and landed in any number of ways. Underneath that coffee table, in a pile of magazines, they found an Esquire magazine that was gearing in on the recent Sharon Tate murders of the previous year. And it highlighted everything about the Charles Manson cult, from their affinity for acid to all the celebrities that they had gotten involved with, the amount of STDs, their almost religious meditation and chants that they were known for when they were living on Spawn Ranch out in California. And so they suspected that MacDonald had probably read this magazine and decided to use the presence of hippies in and around Fort Bragg. One of them, Heidi Stockley, which will come back into the story a little bit later, was the daughter of a very high-ranking officer at Fort Bragg. And she was known to be an avid acid user, pot smoker, streetwalker, for lack of a better term. And she fit the description of the blonde because she also had a floppy hat and hung around with her boyfriend, who was a former soldier from Fort Bragg, and another former soldier who was African American and was a former E6 sergeant, the exact same insignia that MacDonald claimed to have seen on the black man that he said was in his house's jacket. So he was basing this all around real people that people in the town knew about and people on base knew about. But the military investigators, because of the condition of the living room and the blood evidence, really thought he had gotten the idea from reading the Esquire magazine. In addition to that, the pajama top that he claims was ripped off of him in the living room, that same blue pajama top that he used to cover his dead wife, by his own admission, that he said was ripped off in the living room, and he said he used it, he kind of wrapped it around his wrist and used it to stave off the knife and ice pick attack of the four hippies. There were absolutely no fibers from that pajama top found in the living room. Now, if it had been ripped off his body and stabbed multiple times in the living room, don't you think it was pretty likely that at least a few fibers might have been found somewhere in the living room? None were found, absolutely. However, there were lots of fibers from that pajama top found under Colette's body. Now, that could have been from the fact he covered her with it and they just fell off, but it looked as though perhaps they came off because he was manhandling the body. That was what the MPs thought. The fibers from that same shirt were also found in Kimberly and Kristen's bedroom. Now, if you're going back to Jeff MacDonald's story, he said that he only looked in to determine that his daughters were dead. He absolutely did not touch their bodies, nor manipulate their bodies in any way. Well, the fibers found were consistent with the fact he had been around their bodies and doing something perhaps he shouldn't have been doing. One fiber from that pajama top were found under Kristen, the youngest child's fingernail, which led the investigators to believe that when her father started to stab her, that she threw up her hands in a self-defense, and in him striking and stabbing, her fingernail nicked his pajama top, which he still had on at that time, and left a fiber lodged under her fingernail. Also remember, according to military police, they believe Colette, with her dying breath, knowing that her oldest daughter was already dead, having seen her knocked unconscious, tried to defend her youngest daughter by throwing her body over her. And so the force of that would definitely have caused Kristen to probably reach up toward her father and would cause the fiber to be lodged under his fingernail. Surgical gloves. Remember, Jeff MacDonald had a stash of medical supplies from which you could have ran an operating room. Drugs he shouldn't have had, medical equipment that no private citizen should have, were found in his stash. Now, fibers and tips off the fingers of those surgical gloves were found in a couple of places around the house, most notably in between the wall, the mattress, and the headboard of Colette and Jeff MacDonald's bed, under which, on the headboard, the word pig was written in Colette's blood, which led them to believe that he had probably dipped his hand within a glove into his wife's blood and written the word pig on the headboard. I know I'm not coming off as very objective, but I definitely believe this dude did it, and I think he's the biggest liar. He's almost as big a liar as Chris Watts, probably bigger. And I have no sympathy for this man. I know a lot of you subscribers have been asking me my input, what I really thought. I think the sumbitch did it, and I think he should rot. But let's get into what the police, finish talking about what the police found. As we recounted earlier, the MPs and the first responders found the front door of the MacDonald house at 544 Castle Drive at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, locked when they got there. So they went around to the back door and were able to easily get in through the open back door and find the scene inside. However, when investigators went back outside the door to look for any sign that there had been perpetrators in the house that had maybe made an escape, they found what they could only guess and would later turn out to be the murder weapons thrown up under bushes right outside the back door. And so because of that, they found the kitchen knife, the ice pick, and the 2x4, all laying still blood-stained and coated up under a bush right outside the back door. And that was the other clue, along with the fact that bedclothes from Kimberly's bed had been found crumpled in the master bedroom, which led them to believe that a body was carried from one room to the other, and that those blankets were left in a crumpled heap. And they had two questions. Why would murderers that didn't really know where anything was in the house have access to a kitchen knife and an ice pick that were in the MacDonald's kitchen, as well as a piece of lumber that had been used in a home improvement project? And then why would, in fleeing, wouldn't they take those weapons with them instead of throwing them under the bush outside the very door they obviously ran out of? So, because of that evidence, the police were just not buying it. This coupled with the fact that an exact footprint of Jeff MacDonald's left foot was found outside his youngest daughter Kristen's room in her blood on the carpet, obviously when he was moving his wife's body from her room to the master bedroom. All of this combined with the blood evidence, it just didn't add up for the MPs. From February 17th up into all the way through April, MacDonald was interrogated several times by base police, and each time his story changed slightly. That was the final nail in his coffin for the Military Investigation Unit. They officially charged him with 3 counts of murder in May of 1970. And from May of 1970, an Article 30 until September of 1970, an Article 32 trial and court-martial took place at Fort Bragg in the matter of Jeffrey MacDonald and his family. Throughout the Article 32 inquiry, his father-in-law and mother-in-law, Freddie and Edith Kassab, believed their son-in-law's story. They stood by him. They refused to believe that the military police had any other perceptions except that their son was an innocent victim that had tried to protect his family. And due to the fact that Heidi Stokely, remember, her father was a high-ranking officer at the base, she actually came forward and said that she did the crime, that she was there, that she saw it happen, implicating her boyfriend and the African American gentleman in it, as well as another person she said she didn't know. They just happened to be there with him that evening. This combined with the fact that one of the MPs, one of the paramedics, one of the medics that had responded that night, did say he saw a blonde girl with a floppy hat about a mile from the MacDonald house when they were en route. All of this started to cast doubt and kind of made all of the police assumptions more wishful thinking in the minds of the court-martial, or circumstantial evidence rather than hard evidence. And because of all that, the court-martial determined that they just did not have enough evidence to convict a man of murder. And so the case was officially dropped in September of 1970. October of 1970, Jeff MacDonald received an honorable discharge from the United States Army and moved back home to New York City, where he took up a job again at New York Presbyterian Hospital until he moved to Long Beach, California a few months later. December 15th of 1970, Jeff MacDonald went on the Dick Cavett Show, which was kind of an early forerunner to the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Even though Johnny Carson was on simultaneously, Dick Cavett was one of the forerunners of the late night talk show. Very popular, garnered a lot of views. Jeff MacDonald went on Dick Cavett, and during which relayed a story that his father-in-law, Freddie Kassab, didn't really recognize as the original story that Jeff had told the night of the murders. In addition, his attitude on the show was not one of remorse, not one of wanting to find out who killed his family. It was more of being angry at the United States Army for suspecting him, and also just of the humiliation and everything that he had suffered because of being accused of murder. And he basically made a big joke out of it, said the Army only was good at messing things up when it comes to investigating, just made it all about him. He did not come off as anybody that was in mourning, because remember, this was literally the end of the year in which his family was murdered in February. This was December. This is like 9 or 10 months later. Most people would still be in mourning at that point. He obviously wasn't. And that put a seed of doubt in Fred and Edith Kassab's head. And they actually went to Fort Bragg and asked to receive a transcript of the court-martial. Finally, that was granted, and upon reading it, Freddie Kassab realized that with every time he was interrogated, every testimony he gave as part of the court-martial, his story changed. It was totally inconsistent. Not by much, but just a little. You know how when you tell a lie and then you have to tell another lie to cover up for it? Kind of like that. And that's what he was noticing, that it just wasn't consistent. He went back to the military and asked them to please recharge him, please retry him with a new prosecutor. They said because he was no longer in the Army, that it was not a military matter, and if he felt that passionately about it, he should go to the United States or the state government and see about filing a complaint there, which he did in North Carolina. In Raleigh, North Carolina, he filed a citizen's complaint in early 1972, along with the help of a local attorney. And Victor Ward was his name, Warheed was his name, and he helped him file the citizen's complaint in early 1972. It took 2 years of stalemate and argument based on Jeff MacDonald's attorneys saying that the statute of limitations had passed, that it was violating their client's right to a speedy trial, that he was in no way being implicated in the murder. He had been found innocent, which was not exactly true. They just didn't have enough evidence to move forward with it during the court-martial. Still, they felt there was enough there to at least warrant a grand jury, which was convened in August of 1974 before U.S. District Judge Franklin Dupree, who would stay with the case for many, many years, and was presented by attorney Victor Warheed. For 4 months, the grand jury drug on. Jeff MacDonald testified. The MPs that were there that night testified. The people that had been involved with the original court-martial testified. And based on all of the evidence, January 24th, 1975, they returned an indictment on 3 counts of murder, 2 first degree on Kimberly and Colette, and 1 second degree. Excuse me, I got that backwards. 2 counts of second degree murder on Colette and Kimberly, 1 count of first degree murder on Kristen. However, he was able to post bail of $100,000, which was a tremendous amount of money, and it's a lot now, but in 1975 that was really a lot of money, and was actually freed pending the deposition of the charges. His attorneys instantly filed both a speedy trial and double jeopardy complaint, and in July 29th, Judge Dupree denied those, said that his constitutional rights to a speedy trial nor double jeopardy applied because before it had been in a military inquiry, this was a civilian inquiry, did not meet the specifications for either double jeopardy or lack of a speedy trial. August of 1975, again, on an appeal from Jeff MacDonald's attorney, who again said that it was violating his constitutional right to a speedy trial and double jeopardy, appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in North Carolina, who stayed the trial, and they drug on their inquiry until January of 1976, in which in a 2-to-1 split decision, they ordered the charges dropped because it did violate his right to a speedy trial. They found that even though the original trial and inquiry had been in a military court of law, that it was still on the same charges and that there wasn't a clear delineation between civilian and military courts. A series of appeals by the U.S. government followed until 1978 when it was finally heard by the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court, who heard oral arguments in March 1978. In May of 1978, they returned 8-0 the reinstatement of the charges because it did not violate his constitutional rights to a speedy trial, again saying that military versus civilian courts were 2 entirely different matters. He again tried in October to get it thrown out on double jeopardy, and the Fourth Circuit rejected this argument. Again, instead of doing for speedy trial, he was now doing the double jeopardy. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, the one that had affirmed his speedy trial appeal earlier, turned him down and said it was not violating double jeopardy. And the Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear his case. So the trial commenced July 16th, 1979, Federal Courthouse, Raleigh, North Carolina. The prosecutors pretty much put forth all of the evidence that had, during the military investigation, one reason that they could not really use a lot of it was that it had been mishandled. So a lot of that had to be thrown out. They had lost some of the rubber tips of the rubber glove. They lost some of the fibers from the blue pajama top. So they couldn't really put any of that into the new trial because that would have caused a mistrial. But they kind of stuck to the other evidence that was indisputable, the blood evidence, and the condition of the blue pajama top based on Jeff MacDonald's story. Basically, it had 48 small and smooth, perfectly ice pick shaped stab holes in it, perfectly symmetrical. In Jeff MacDonald's testimony, he said that the shirt was ripped off of him in the living room in the early stages of the attack, and he used it to ward off an ice pick attack. Well, common sense dictates that if you're swinging your wrists around with a piece of cloth wrapped around it, that when an ice pick or a knife strikes that piece of cloth, that the puncture holes are not going to be even or pretty in any stretch of the imagination. And the pajama top showed that every single one of the stab wounds were perfectly lined up with wounds that had been on Colette's body, leading them to put forth the assumption that after he killed her and covered her with the pajama top, he stood above her and stabbed her in a fit of rage. That was number one. Number two was the fact that they reintroduced the Esquire magazine, saying that that's where the idea of the hippies came from. They threw out the evidence about Heidi Stokely and even the MP that said he might have seen a blonde-haired woman about a mile from the house. Therefore, just trying to put that final nail in MacDonald's coffin, so to speak. Probably two of the most damning pieces of evidence that the prosecution presented at that trial was an audio tape made by military investigators in April 6, 1970, during his court-martial, that basically heard Jeff MacDonald, just like he had been on the Dick Cavett show, very non-matter-of-fact about the murder of his family. Not really overly concerned about it, not really in a manic state wanting them to find the murderers, just kind of blasé. And the recording in the secession showed how the story changed from interrogation to interrogation. Also, the fact that Jeff was a serial womanizer was also brought in, and they brought in several women that had had affairs with him while he was still married to Colette to prove that had been a thing. And Jeff himself, during his testimony, admitted that he had had sex with a lot of women, but none of it meant anything. And again, on the stand, he relayed yet another version of the events from that night. And his expert witnesses that he called in to refute the evidence about the pajama top really couldn't refute it, because the prosecutors actually took a blue pajama top, wrapped it around one of them's wrists, and then staged an ice pick attack in front of the jury so that they could see how it would be, how the stab holes would go. They unfurled it and held it next to the pajama top that had been entered into evidence, and it was obvious the difference between something that was used for defense in a real fight versus something that had been methodically and perfectly stabbed. In addition to that, the doctor's testimony that Jeff's wounds had been superficial and almost surgeon-specific did not bode well for Dr. MacDonald. Finally, the evidence of the blood being around the house and showing that the living room, even though it had supposedly been the stage of the biggest part of the fight, was not any type of upheaval. The fact that the blood stains from all four members of the MacDonald family were found in various places around the house, totally blowing Jeff's account of the murder out of the water, led, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury to find Jeff MacDonald guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder in the death of one count of first-degree murder in the death of Kristen, the youngest daughter, 2 counts of second-degree murder in the murders of his wife, Colette, and his oldest daughter, Kimberly. Why were these differences made? First-degree murder carries with it a burden of proving intent. He actually intended to kill the victim. Whereas second-degree murder can be something like a crime of passion, something that happens in the moment. Well, they truly believed that the fight with Colette and the accidental clubbing of Kimberly led those 2 young ladies to be murdered, though not because he had an intention of murdering them. It just kind of happened. However, Kristen was intentionally murdered because she was a 2-year-old child, almost 3, asleep in her bed. She was of no danger to Jeff MacDonald, yet he killed her anyway. Probably, they assumed, to get rid of any witnesses, though she was 3. MacDonald's attorneys immediately filed an appeal, and the application was rejected in September of 1979. And again in November by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, November 20th of 1979. He was remanded to federal custody, and in June of 1979, in a further a crusade to get his innocence proven, he contracted with author Joe McGinnis to write a book about the case. For over 2 years, Joe McGinnis had absolute unfettered access uh, to Dr. MacDonald, in which he went over every part of MacDonald's story, his life, his marriage, everything. And during that time, MacDonald was of the opinion that McGinnis was sympathetic to him and would write a glowing review of how an innocent man was sitting in prison. Incidentally, he had been sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences to run concurrently. So, in 1983, McGinnis's book Fatal Vision hit the New York Times bestseller list, but did the exact opposite. It painted Dr. MacDonald as a narcissistic sociopath who was indeed guilty of killing his family. As a result, MacDonald sued McGinnis in 1987 for fraud. The stalemate in court resulted in a mistrial, so it was settled on August 21st, 1987 for $325,000 out of court. McGinnis had to pay MacDonald and his relatives $325,000 for slander and lies. And I find that laughable. Incidentally, the book Fatal Vision was a New York Times bestseller for over 6 years, was made into a TV movie, which was a hit on the NBC Movie of the Week in 1984. It's on YouTube. I highly recommend Googling Fatal Vision. You will enjoy it. MacDonald wasn't done yet. This man has filed more appeals than I think anyone else. In 1980, he again appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they actually reversed MacDonald's conviction in a 2-to-1 split on the grounds that the 9 years between the actual murders and the trial did indeed violate his right to a speedy trial. Now, this same court was the one, as you remember, that in 1979 did eventually affirm that he was violating his rights to a speedy trial, even though that was later reversed by the United States Supreme Court. So again, he went back to that same court that looked on him favorably back then to try to get it reversed again, and it worked. He was freed in August of 1980, even though he had to post $100,000 bail again. But he had the money. He got it from McGinnis. December 18th, 1980, it was reversed pending another decision by the United States Supreme Court. And in March of 1982, they ruled in a 6-3 split decision that MacDonald's rights to a speedy trial had not been violated once again. He again reappealed on the basis of double jeopardy, and 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case again. MacDonald's defense team didn't give up there, though. They decided to go at it from a different method. Citing the numerous amounts of evidence that had been introduced during his military court-martial and then that had been left out of his normal trial, they, in their opinion, thought that that would have consequented a mistrial and would allow MacDonald the right to another trial. So in March of 1985, December of 1985, October 1986, October 1991, and June of 1992, they appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals again, requesting a mistrial and a new trial. All of them were rejected. The Kassabs, who had been one of the major reasons that his appeals had failed because they were at every appeal hearing, they were even sitting during oral arguments during the times the U.S. Supreme Court had overseen Jeff MacDonald's case, they both died in 1994. And one final appeal, his final appeal, was logged in 2008 on the behest of his second wife, Catherine MacDonald, who was a preschool teacher that he had met once in Baltimore. They filed the final appeal. And it was denied, of course. MacDonald was transferred to Maryland to be closer to his new wife, so he sits right now at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He applied for his first round of parole in 2005, was automatically denied. His next scheduled parole hearing is in May of 2020. And that's where Jeffrey MacDonald sits today, in federal prison, Cumberland, Maryland, for the murder of his entire family. So that's the story of Jeff MacDonald. What do you guys think? I think all of the evidence, the blood evidence, the way that it was kind of sketched out, paints a picture of a man that I think had a temper tantrum or went into a fit of rage, probably over a physical altercation with his wife. He, in a rage, killed her, accidentally killed his oldest daughter while trying to kill his wife, and as a result, finished her off and finished off his younger daughter just to be rid of her. I believe he was unhappy in his marriage. It was kind of a shotgun wedding, as I had said before, with her being pregnant with Kimberly. And I think he was just overall unhappy. He was a Green Beret, he was a surgeon, so he could have truly lived the good single life, and I think that's what he wanted. And unfortunately, his wife and children just got in the way. Oh, and yes, this is something I didn't mention from the beginning, though I should have. Colette was indeed pregnant with their first son at the time of her death, though at that time a fetus of only 3 to 4 months would not be considered a person under murder laws, unlike when we talked about the Texas bell tower murders. The young lady that was 9 months pregnant, her baby was considered a child when it had been. If he had gone to trial, he would have also been prosecuted for that baby's murder because the baby was 9 months, was a 9-month fetus and could have survived on its own. However, the MacDonald baby was not quite far along for that to be an indication in the trial. So that's where we sit. I think he did it. I think he's sitting on death row, or not death row, but sitting in prison, life in prison, for very good reason. What do you guys think? Let me know. Have you read the books? I know some of you have. Have you seen the movie? If you haven't, look for it here on YouTube. It's a great watch. It is 3 hours long, just to let you know. It's got some great actors in it, including Andy Griffith, one of my favorites. I think you'll enjoy it. Anyway, guys, that's it for this edition. I'll be back soon with another true crime video. Hope you're enjoying Keto Wing. I certainly am. Remember, y'all, ketosis. Keto comic.